welcome to the G-Spot!
You know what? I just noticed your earrings, Sarah. They are very appropriate for today's topic.
I actually wore them on purpose. What are we
I
talking about today?
we are talking about satanic panic and mostly in fiction because as we have noticed recently, if you have been watching Stranger Things season 4, there is a heck of a lot of callbacks to the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. So
hmm
it's going to be fun. We're not going to go true crime because
There's going to
we
be
are,
crime, but we're not getting
yes,
into the crime. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right. So chronological order. And I think the one thing I know I'm going to touch on a little bit too, and I know Dee will, is also just this. They talking about this through the nerd lens, not the crime
Mhm.
lens, and about what nerds and tabletopping geeks went through, not necessarily. But not that to be said, there will be murder. Blah, blah. All right, the year 1970 something.
Yeah. 1970s is probably when satanic panic started because freaking Dungeons and Dragons was out. Oh, actually, maybe it started before that because rock and roll music was happening, and that was the devil's
Devil.
music.
It was the devil's
So,
music. And so there and Devil's Lettuce was around from the 20s, so it's been around.
Reefer Madness. So, if you were listening to rock and roll and you were playing D&D, you're just in league with the devil at this point. Doesn't matter. So, coming back full circle to Stranger Things, um, we're we're in the 80s now because the 70s, whatever, rock and roll and lettuce, we'll get over it. Stranger Things, I love it so much. If you
I know you
haven't
do.
noticed, the first 3 seasons were so good, and everyone's like, "Oh my god, Stranger Things, it's amazing." And I'm like, "Yeah, I totally agree." This is like the one time when I'm not being like a dickhead contrarian, like, just because it's mainstream doesn't mean it's good. And now I'm like, it is good. But season 4, immediately with the whole Eddie Munson being into D&D, listening to rock and roll, having long hair. He's got black fingernails, doesn't he? I think he does. I think he paints his nails black.
Does he? I can't quite remember. Maybe.
I feel like he's got black fingernails because
I,
that just completes the look.
and he might not, because remember they are in Hawkins, Indiana. So they actually talk about that in you can see in the show when you look at the California kids and the Indiana kids, like they're behind in fashion. And I don't think black nail polish was even invented yet, so it would have been Margaret on, and that was something that started in the New York
Hey,
and California scene near the later 80s. So he might not have had that yet.
no, I'm looking at a picture of him. He's got bare nails, but if he did have black fingernails, I could definitely see.
Yeah. As a resident goth, I can attest to that, yes.
Yeah. So, Eddie Munson, who for some reason they named him to sound so much like Eddie Munster.
I thought
It's
that
like
too, yeah.
one letter off.
hmm
And I'm just like, Eddie Munster, like a werewolf. Like they play that I was a teenage werewolf
hmm
or whatever when we first meet Eddie Munson.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is he gonna like transform somehow? Like a
We'll see.
werewolf?
Maybe that was a hint. I don't know. Or maybe it's just his hair.
Maybe. I mean, but like his hair is like his hair looks like Nancy's hair because she's all
He
I
has
like
he's got a Ramones look. It's a very classic,
yeah.
Slash, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, he's got the hair of the time, but yeah, I'm hoping for some kind of transformation from him because they're really playing up like this whole werewolfy angle.
Maybe.
So maybe Reese Darby comes out and he's like, "Hey, you're part of my pack
Oh,
now."
let me stop it. I just listened to a stand up. It's so good. Go listen to it if you haven't. So I know one thing to contribute to what you're saying is what's important in Stranger Things, now that we're in this time period and to link up to the Satanic Panic, this incident happened and the timeline prior with it. So now this is like the catalyst in the 70s for the beginning of the downfall of the Stranger Things kids in the D&D community. Do you know who that
Classic,
is?
classic Charles Manson.
Yeah, yeah. He was the beginning of that, like that, just a taste of it, and then it did not go well for
For
Eddie and the Hellfire
anybody.
Club. Yeah, I was like, oh, people hiding their dice under the table. Like it was not mine.
Gosh, yeah, I can't imagine like just having a hobby that people are like, you're probably murdering kids in your off time,
Yeah.
just like
What's
because you
standard
play
fare?
this.
Standard
Yeah.
fare.
So, but funny that Eddie or that you would show Charles Manson because I heard Eddie Munson and I was like, oh, like Charles Manson. And also
Yeah.
one letter off, and I was like, okay, is that like,
It's
are they playing like that angle? Like he's like the ringleader, but if they wanted him to be a Charles Manson type, he does have like the crazy, like, whatever. But he's not short enough. Like Charles Manson was like 5'3", so
yeah. Hmm.
you got to be short and insane to pull off a Manson-esque character.
Hmm.
But yeah, I like Eddie. Anyway, moving on. So, if you haven't heard of the West Memphis Three, which have you been living under a rock? They, I'm going to say that they're the most famous victims of the Satanic Panic because they were three high school aged boys who were convicted of murdering three younger boys.
I might
And
I might have a picture. I have to see it. There's different ones here. Let's see. Is it this one right here? No. What
no,
is it? This one. These are all exist though. They might be in this mix
yes.
right here. Okay, there we are. Yeah.
Just like the whole
Nailed
moral
it.
outrage
Nailed
of
it.
playing Dungeons and Dragons and people thinking you're worshiping the devil, and then like people freaking Diane Sawyer, I can't believe she's on here
It
talking
was
about
a
satanic
it
panic.
was hot, man. Like it
Oh
was a
yeah, I'm
good this is a hot
sure.
topic.
Yeah, it's like school shootings these days. You just got to cover
Mhm.
it all and then you get all the ratings.
Mhm.
So, Satanic Panic was the poster child of the day. Too bad it was too young to remember any of the news coverage. But the West Memphis Three were in the 90s, so we've kind of skipped ahead a little bit in time. But the ringleader, Damien Eccles, he's a real guy. He was actually convicted. He was put in jail. He's out now. He was exonerated, thank God. But he was just like a goth in Arkansas. And so these murders happened in this small little evangelical Catholic town,
A
Christian town.
a big pattern with all of these stories that we're going to talk about, it's the Bible Belt of America. That's always
Yeah.
what it is. It's always somewhere where there's just no culture. So if you wear all black, it's like, whoa. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was definitely, and he really leaned into it. Like he was pulling like Manson style theatrics in the courtroom. I mean, not maybe that bad, but like he was talking about, Aleister Crowley and Anton LaVey and Satan, and
Mhm.
like he
All role
didn't,
models. Yeah.
yeah, he didn't really grasp the severity of it. Well, actually, um, according to interviews, he was like, "This is so ridiculous. I had nothing to do with these murders.
Hmm.
There's no way I could be convicted." And so he was just like, I'm a high schooler. I'm going to play into this, like, whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's where, like, the Eddie Munson walking on the table talking about,
Yeah.
being a bad guy and I'm the devil. And, like, yeah,
Yeah.
that was definitely, like,
A nod.
reminded me of Damien Eccles. And I was like, yeah, he's going to get pinned for something. And then
Yeah.
poor Chrissy comes
Yeah.
over to his trailer. And I'm like,
They
this
called
kid is
it.
going to jail for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and
So,
that's the satanic panic thing was a big thing in nerd culture too, because like some other stuff on here, like it's this was a big thing. Like what we're seeing here is like people really thought like already what is it? You have outsiders, right? These are kids or that already don't get along, and then they have to hide the game like we see in Stranger Things because they're gonna get beaten up if they don't keep it quiet. Like Lucas is a great example of that.
oh yeah.
Yeah, and then so in like this, there's a public community of anytime something bad happens, if one of these kids is involved in it, it immediately jumps to the game. And like the game itself, have you ever played D&D? D?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
It's
it's a,
in my name, Sarah.
exactly, and it's all like good. It's a very classic good versus evil.
Yeah,
Like there's monsters and stuff like that, but you're not a monster. Like there's no like there. It's like just like a fairy tale, and it really caused a big chaos along the Bible Belt, and that's Hawkins, Indiana. Totally checks out for that.
yeah. But even not in the Bible Belt, like there were, it was just like
Mhm.
if you had a weird looking murder, yeah, let's blame it on
The
satanic
nerds.
panic. Let's
It's the
blame it on
nerds.
the outcasts of
Hmm.
society. You know, someone paints their fingernails black, worshiping Satan. You can't do that around here. There's also references to D&D in Riverdale, and they're not like it's like
Always bringing it back to Riverdale.
I'm sorry. They really like lean into like the satanic aspect of it because like kids are getting murdered and like committing suicide while playing the game, and it's much more like
Oh my god.
it's like if Satanic Panic were real, I guess is what
Is it,
Riverdale
are
was
were they
going
playing
for.
were they playing D&D or Jumanji? Because this sounds
No,
pretty.
it's oh god, I forgot what it's called, but it's whatever. It's just like their version of D&D, and there's like a
Okay.
gargoyle. Oh, it's like something in gargoyles. Like
Okay. Okay, it's a fictional game.
yes, it's a fictional game, but it's supposed to be D&D of the Riverdale realm, and
Got
so
it. Okay,
their
so
parents played it, and they like did some crazy shit and like murdered people, and so it's like they're like, what if Satanic Panic were real? And these popular kids, because they're all like hot, popular jock and cheerleader
oh,
dudes
okay.
playing this something in gargoyles. God, I can't believe I forgot the name. Griffins and gargoyles.
I was
That's
saying,
it.
hey, Griffin's Harry Potter.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And there's like a gargoyle king who's like,
No, I'm sorry. I just like I'm interrupting you, but like we're talking about these two fandoms, and like I forgot Harry Potter was also a satanic panic.
oh yeah, I had a cousin whose dad would not let her see Harry Potter because there was witchcraft in
Yeah,
it.
and like there was actually like a rise in people buying witchcraft books and wizards, like in like stores and stuff. So like this is just like never like it. Nerds just can't. They can't get a break.
Yeah, you can't win if you're on the fringes of society. You know, if
Yeah.
you're not like the Jason in Stranger Things season 4 with like perfect basketball star, and he's got that little swoopy haircut, and he's
The
just a perfect
35-year
Aryan
old
race
man. Yeah.
child. Yeah,
Yeah.
like if you're not that person, don't step out of line, and you won't be accused of murder. So
Yeah.
words to live by. Except if you're in Riverdale, then anything is fair in Riverdale.
It's Riverdale. It's not. It's a different comic universe. They don't have to follow the same
Yeah.
rules.
You can shoot people with bows and arrows. You can, poison people with drugs.
Hmm.
You can fake your own death. It's
Yeah.
it's a it's quite a place to live. And honestly, I would love to live there because I guess if you're living in Riverdale, you're just ripped. So,
Oh, Riverdale.
I know it's your favorite show,
So
but
that I've seen. I saw one episode. It was the pilot.
yes. Well, the camp in it just hooked me because I never watched anything so campy. And I was just like, you
Yeah,
know
I
what?
can see how that is the like.
You just
Yeah.
turn off the thinking part of your brain and you
I
just
didn't. I
watch
didn't know
it.
they had a satanic panic moment. That's really interesting.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's yeah, and like the cops are just like, yeah, we're here
Mm-hmm.
just hanging out playing Griffins and Gargoyles and
Griffin the
doing
Goblin.
drugs, and they got fizzle rocks, which I think is meth.
Oh,
So,
that sounds like math. Yeah.
yeah. So
Well,
it's
that's.
pretty amazing. So, back to the real Satanic Panic. All right, there was Damien Eccles. There was a young man whose last name was Miss Kelly, and then there was another guy. And I'm sorry I forgot your name.
There are so many like there's just like all of this stuff like it's there's so
Yeah.
I will say this I to be fair since you took the early years I kind of feel bad because you did like 7 cases like figure it out like so it's okay we remember the key people.
Yes. There's some dudes. I'm
Just a
sorry.
lot of
There's
guys.
lots of documentaries about it, like
Hmm.
you can watch. And as soon, like I'm in a last podcast on the left. Shout out.
Yeah,
Group on
talk
Facebook.
to us.
Yeah. And they do a good episode on the West Memphis Three and the
Yeah.
Satanic Panic.
Hmm.
And the whole group was just like, did anyone watch Stranger Things 4 and just see the Satanic Panic references? And I was like, yes, literally
Yes,
everyone.
the world did. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
So,
yeah. No, I think there's the documentary thing there's a lot out there, and
yes, we're not going to
yeah.
beat
Well,
it over the head because we're
we
nerds.
yeah, and speaking of documentaries, did you know that I watched a couple to talk about my satanic panic subject? Transition. So
She's better at transitioning than I am.
mine is a little bit different. So I had this feeling I was going to talk a little bit more anyway, just because I want to talk to you. I even have like little notes here about this satanic panic that I have a personal connection with because I've played this game, and most people have actually never heard of this game. The hardcore nerds have, but like the general nerd public and non nerds haven't, and that is the vamp.
Oh, gatekeeping in the nerd community,
I'm not
Sarah.
gatekeeping. I always explain it when people ask me what it is, but like in my experience, it's not. Have you? So do you know this? But you know this because I told you what it was when we were talking about
Yes.
this episode, and that's the Vampire Masquerade. And
Yes.
I think you are a true nerd. So I'm not gatekeeping like you're not a real nerd, but like that just shows you like you've never heard of this game before.
Yes. I may
Okay.
have like my husband and his brother play a lot of games, and I feel like someone made Vampire Masquerade into like
A
a
video game.
video
They
game.
did. They did make it like
Yeah.
kind of like a attempted World of Warcraft, not World War II. No, and it's okay. It's better as like a well. I'm gonna go into this a little bit about this. So because like especially our fan base here, the four fans we have, everybody knows about
Well,
D&D. Hi guys, everybody knows about D&D. But not a lot of people know about Vampire Masquerade. So I'm going to take you in a little bit to explain to you what this is before I can even get into the satanic panic aspect because it's important. Um, so essentially what the situation is that this is like during like the height of like D&D, all of that. This is the 80s. These two guys, I'm looking at my notes. I'm not looking at the camera. Please know I'm not ignoring you. And these guys like they get together and they're like these kids that play D&D in high school. And so what they do is, as a dungeon master, you know this, you can either play games in the book or you can write your own. So these particular teens were like exceptional at writing games. So they would sell their own stories to other people. And then they were like, hey, why don't we start making our own books and making our own games? And that's when they created White Wolf Publishing, which is a very well known publishing company. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is really known more in the horror geek world. So, like, it's really close to my home. And the short of the long story is that now we've had the satanic pattern, right? We have the 80s, we have all this. We do have punk. Punk exists. Goth exists. We have the Cure. We have all 80s, all of that. But now what happened is that what defined a punk and a goth took a huge shift in the early 90s, not because they didn't exist before, but because of the culture. So we have the Berlin Wall falling. We have grunge music. So Pearl Jam, Tool, all of that. And America, like Reagan was now putting all his shit. It was like everything was
you
going
didn't
real.
mention Nirvana.
That's later, actually. So this is the dark. This is like the shitty part, and like
Shitty
Pearl
music.
Jam had their first it's Pearl Jam, right? Yeah, Jeremy. And so people don't even know this. That song, like this was the '90s, the early '90s was the first school shooting ever in history. It wasn't Columbine. It was Jeremy in Texas, and he went and shot himself, but he went and did it in front of his whole classmates because he was bullied. Columbine was the first one where the bullies,
Mm-hmm.
quote, went after
Jeremy has spoken. I remember that
Jeremy spoke it.
song.
So like this is like the dark part of like this 90s and like the economy of crash like and this is when everything started really there was like all this started in the 80s, but this is when we started to feel the effects of everything. Like now like the made in China phenomenon, all of the other like people were losing their jobs. So that culture really spawned something. So what was happening was the fantasy world of, you're a hero, you fight the bad guy, you get your treasure, and then you do it all over again, which is what originally a lot of most Dungeons and Dragons was. It was still popular, but it wasn't like There was, the world needed something more. So White Wolf Publishing partnered with another company, and they invented Vampire Masquerade. But here's the difference: is with Vampire Masquerade, there's a couple key differences. First thing is, until literally, and it's funny because I watched a really fantastic documentary on Amazon Prime. It's free, you can watch it with ads, about the creation of this. I really recommend you watch it, because I'm going to say this quote directly from this documentary. Vampire Masquerade is the most well-known cultural influence that is the biggest, which is the best kept secret. So everybody knows the influences and the pulp culture effects of Vampire Masquerade, and nobody knows where it came from, that it came from Vampire Masquerade. And that is the best way to explain that. So all of you right now listening, all four of you, you are going to realize that you've known about this your whole life. It's been rampant. So what happens is, the first thing that made it different was, and all this I'm explaining to you has to do with the satanic panic aspect. So this is important. The first thing is that it was the first time monsters were the main character. Classically in D&D, the vampire was a ghoul and a monster. Now, yeah, we had like Lost Boys, we had Interview with the Vampire, Dracula, we had these beautiful things, but they were still a monster. Even though they were hot, you still wanted to kill them. They were, maybe Anne Rice's stuff's a little bit different, but like, so this was the first time where a player would play the monster. Okay. So then the second part of that is, because you played the monster and you were top of the food chain, the journey and the battles did not become about defeating the monster and going on the journey. The battles became internal, dealing with being the monster. What does that mean? Social hierarchy. And the other thing was, D&D, you have the outcast playing the hero. And then in Vampire Masquerade, you have an outcast person playing an even greater outcast in this game society. And that right there cultured this like existential and therapeutic experience in gaming that nobody had ever seen before. And it seems so silly now to think like this idea of like playing a vampire, the turmoil and what they're going through, but like never been done before. So it was a big deal. The other thing was, they decided in order to make themselves seem more different, is that, and you, if anybody knows this, it's not a lot, but there's a good amount of math in D&D. We even saw it in Stranger Things. Like, it's a lot of dice rolling and turn based. And you are a character, but you see in these kids when they're playing the game Hellfire Club, they're not like, I'm Junzandu, the wizard from Hightower. Like, they're not doing that. They're talking with themselves, playing their game. Like, it's kind of like playing a video game where the video game does all the work for you and you're back controlling the character. That's
Yeah,
how.
it's a little lame that they don't add in like just like a touch of like the role
Well,
playing aspect of it,
well,
but it's always like they're in a fight and they're like roll the die,
well.
and then
Here's the thing, though. That actually didn't exist back then. That does exist now, but back in the 80s, that type of play did not exist. So Stranger Things is actually very accurate.
ooh, good
The
job, Stranger Things.
the game that made what you just described for D&D commonplace, Vampire Masquerade. I love this game. I play it all the time. So Vampire Masquerade actually reduced the number of like roll dying and stats, and they actually made it more like, okay, they're actually going to play the part. They're going to do this. They encourage costumes in their book, things like that. So it really was was the first time the idea of the character consuming you became standard for a tabletop RPG. So then with that, it attracted the LARPers, the theater kids, and it attracted for the first time huge amounts of goth and like just more average people, like more like theatrical people to this gaming world. So then all these outside influences from these other, so theater, goth, and LARPing, all type of outsider or geek or something. So they all came in. They brought these influences into this game, and so Vampire Masquerade was the first game where you got people wearing costumes, acting it out instead of all sitting around a table. They're still like rolling and all that, but now you play it in like an open space, things like that. You move around. Vampire Masquerade was actually the creation of that. So this is all very important. I know I'm talking about a bunch of nerd stuff, but this is because then what happens was, so you got people. that like, or just, Rebecca from accounting, then she's going to go ahead and go home, put on her white makeup and her blood mouth and her black wig. And like also too, they talk about it. This was the first game where it was very sexy. It was a sexy game. They're vampires. Also too, a White Wolf Productions was the first company ever to have a 50-50 ratio of men and women. So
Wow.
people don't realize this Vampire Masquerade is responsible for the majority of female playing tabletop RPG players now, because it was story driven and character driven. It wasn't like sitting with your paper doing a bunch of math. So it was this huge phenomenon. But now you got, these goth, like you're in the Bible Belt and you're a goth. You got to find your fellow goth friends and you got to get into costume. Now you're like, I'm Balthazar of Romania, and your ruffle collar and your fangs. And so like, it didn't help the image of like the freak label, and it got even crazier because now they weren't hiding in the basement, doing all. Now they were like out and about. But the difference with Vampire Masquerade is there is an empowerment to it, and they actually talk about it a lot. And people play it because it's therapeutic, because you're not fighting a monster, you're working on yourself. People in the documentary, one girl even says, she goes, I like Vampire Masquerade because it's cheaper than therapy. And that's what it is. You create these characters and then you work through some internal problem you really have. So people were very proud and very loud about this. It wasn't a quiet hush hush thing. And because it started attracting more mainstream people, it just wasn't as hidden as much. So it really put it on the map. But then it was almost the reverse of, in the 70s, early 80s Satanic Panic, you had not too many people knew about what D&D was, but they knew all about the murders. So when we get to the 90s, now we get to a point where it's a lot of people knew about the role playing, but not a lot of people knew about the murders. And I'm going to go ahead. I might. This is not. There's no evidence. I'm just saying. I associate that with the internet, because now people had more, like they could like research things like, that's not real, that's not like there was just more accessible information than there was, so rumors couldn't spread as much. But the one of this now there what happened was, there have been cases, and I tried to find the forensic file but I couldn't, but there was about a 5-year period where every time there was anything that looked ritualistic of like a murder or crime, they could be like, could it be the vampires? But they never really proved it. But there is the one case that did prove it, and this did strike the nerd community, and that is Rod Farrell. He grew up in Kentucky, Murray, Kentucky, and it's the same thing you just said. It's the classic case of like the few goth kids that came together, and so they're probably more sexual. They like black clothes. They listen to weird music. Like, it caused a problem. I'll hit my camera. But here's the weird thing about this group: there's no evidence that they actually played Vampire Masquerade. We do know they played out fictional scenarios, which usually led to like sex and self harm for pleasure relief. But the gist of what he did was, these group of teens actually would cut themselves, drink each other's blood, had ceremonies. There's a documentary about this that I think is too soon after the actual murders. It takes place in 98 and the murders happened in 96. And it's one of those it's so cringy because they just let these damn kids say whatever they want. And they literally talk about being able to, like, when we drink blood, like, we can read minds and we can this. I am the sire. I'm the. It is the most. Like, I hope these kids now are watching this like so embarrassed about how crazy they sound.
Classic
And
teenagers.
it's like, I sometimes when I watch it, I want to be like, if anybody had just told them about the kink community, they wouldn't sound so crazy. Because half their shit is like, this is just like a relief and a pleasure. Like, now we have these terms for what they were doing back then. We don't have it and have it back then, so they must be vampires. Like, he literally talks about like, I can read people's minds, like I can fly. It was like, and he means it. It's insane. But what happens is Rod Farrell is kind of like an outcast of the group, and he gets together with some other vampire friends to go meet like a girl he was dating, and somehow or another he took it to the next level. And I'm going to say their names because we say victims' names. Naomi Ruth Queen and Richard Wondorf, they went into their in a Florida home. He went in, he crowbarred them to death, and essentially he claimed he was a vampire, and he was like, practicing his rights and all this. But like, we don't, pretty sure he never even drank their blood. But it was on the Bible Belt, and like these kids, like, we don't know if they did this or not, but even back in Murray, Kentucky, there was an incident. This is trigger warning for anybody, violence by animals. But they went in, they broke into a animal shelter and like they like had sacrifices and rituals. Like they cut dog like puppies' legs off while they were still alive and all this other shit. And so like people came to this massacre and they were convinced it was these vampire kids. We actually don't know if it was them. They don't really do violence against animals, but like so like there's this like murder in this all these dogs being murdered, and then this kid goes and kills somebody, and then they're like, this is it, like it's the vampire scare. So the difference with this satanic panic is that nobody actually thought they were really vampires, unlike, they're worshiping the devil. But the panic was that there's a lost in reality, and these kids being introduced to the devil is making them do crazy things and they think they're vampires. And it absolutely demolished the community. They had to fight back. Like the publishers were being, it was like people walking down the street were getting harassed all over the world because it was a global thing. And I actually remember this as a child, and it's interesting people don't remember this, but there was a real panic for like 2 or 3 years that there were vampire cults. They even in the documentary, cults, 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 and everything was cults. And there was this big panic about that, and it really affected the fandom. People had to hide all of that, and if without Vampire Masquerade, here we go, we wouldn't have Blade. They actually we had Blade, but the Blade we know now came all from that. They actually kind of stole the artist's work for the first movie, so they brought them on for the second. So literally the guy who did the art for this show, it was brought back on. So like look at like how Blade is this. Like that kind of punk, you
Yeah.
know. Yeah. And
Like
then like
gothic
that
vampire.
thought, yeah, it's cool, edgy, very 90s,
Yeah.
things
Mhm.
like that. Here's what Rod Farrell looked like. And here's the other thing is, did you ever watch the Night Stalker documentary?
No, but I know
This
him.
is this is like almost an exact shot from the Richard Ramirez shot. So it's pretty clear that like this kid, like he probably valued like, serial killers more than.
Yeah.
And then these are the actual get ready to cringe. This is the
Woo!
1990s. Keep in mind now, in Kentucky in 1996, this is what goths look like. I would tell you right now, this is like today, the
I mean,
average.
that's not, that looks okay. That looks more, you can get away with that
Yeah,
today, being a
and
goth.
there they are, like they're like kids. And
Yeah.
then this is a shot from, so Vampire Masquerade still goes on today, and it is like a LARPing convention, like what you described. So now D&D and all this other, they do now that the acting part, but like that, like back in the Stranger Things time, that did not exist. Vampire
Just a bunch of
Masquerade,
math nerds.
yeah, and so because of Vampire Masquerade, we have Blade. We have Underworld. They actually sued Underworld and settled out of case because they literally stole the story from it. Like the Lycan versus the
Mm,
vampire is like
yeah.
literally an entire book from Vampire Masquerade. And they were like, we can't, like it was one of those things where it's like they settled outside of court because they couldn't even like hide, like, no, we totally stole your story. We hints from like Buffy the Vampire. That was like another big one.
Slayer. Big, big word to miss in that title.
Buffy the Vampire
Slayer.
Slayer. I have a hard time watching. I can't watch Buffy the Vampire. And we won't get into that. There's a misogyny issue and other things that I have an issue with. But all of that had to do with it. So, and I mean, just so many other things now that we know was like common vampire knowledge and like pop culture. It was like started from this game. And there was an era of just like murders and cult findings. Like a lot of times whenever they found like animals being like mutilated like in a circle or whatever, that was turned into like it was the vampires. And now it's really worn off now, and I think the internet is a big reason why we don't have to deal with this kind of anymore, because it's just another classic case of someone finds something that makes them happy. It's not mainstream, so they have a small group. And then if it's not like football or cheerleading, or not saying those are bad things, I'm talking about like in that time, what that looked like. It's just in the case, and so that was a really big satanic panic in the '90s that most people don't know even existed, and it was a wild time in the Bible Belt in the 1990s.
Oh, it's always a wild time down there.
Woo! Yeah, yeah. And then now we have and like we talked about Harry Potter, and honestly, we're probably something new is going to
Even
come along.
Twilight, a little. Parents were like, "Oh, my kids are
Oh
sucking
my
each other's blood.
god.
They're
That's
trying to
my little
sparkle."
Satanic Panic Bubble. Do you have anything else you'd like to say, Dee?
No, I think we've done enough damage today. But
All right.
we could go on about Twilight
We're gonna
because
have. We already did a Twilight episode, so hold on.
no,
We'll
no,
get on
we're
it
done.
later.
I'm
We'll get
cutting
on
it
it
off.
later. Cut, cut, cut. Well, I hope everybody learned a little bit something about Satanic Panic and all that jazz. All
Yeah, at least a
right.
little bit about it because and go play some
Go
D&D. It's fun.
go play some D&D. Go play some Vampire Masquerade or Vampire
Go
Bloodline.
play
Go play.
Weirdies from Outer Space, whatever you want.
Get in person with your friends over Zoom if you can't because of COVID. Like, get out there, man. Do your thing.
Yeah,
Mm.
it's fun to role play.